writes all these things down. Plato started out wanting to be a dramatist, but you see, drama was dying out as a viable art form, and there just wasn't any creative energy, any potential within it for Plato to do anything with it. So he ends up inventing the dialogue, where you have these, characters. Socrates is the lead character always in the dialogues of Plato, analyzing everything to death, but you have this vestigial relic of the dramatic form in the dialogue itself. And so Nietzsche says the Platonic dialogue was the life raft that Greek tragedy sort of clung onto as it was going down. And so then he sort of paints this picture of Greek civilization falling apart and the coming on stage of the Socratic man, and then Spengler picks this idea up from him and says, what if this can be generalized into a universal rule? What if we look at all these great high civilizations and we find a turning point in every one of them where the Socratic man comes on stage and begins to question everything, and the culture begins to fall apart? And Spengler's response was, yes, indeed. Every one of these cultures, all the great high civilizations, fall apart when they shift over to a period of rationalism. It happens in our case when Rousseau comes in. Rousseau and Voltaire, there we are back again with the French, questioning everything, analyzing everything. Sort of Voltaire making fun of religion, and Rousseau sort of bringing in this kind of rationality and a kind of romanticism, but just sort of questioning everything. So our culture then begins to fall apart, according to Nietzsche and Spengler, right about in the 18th century, analogous to what took place with the Greeks in the time of Socrates. And then Spengler generalizes this, and he looks at Hindu civilization, and he says, well, the Buddha represented this aspect, the Socratic man appearing on stage in Hindu civilization. Here we have an individual appearing on stage who will have nothing to do with the gods, and original Hinayana Buddhism just has nothing to do with the gods whatsoever. It's a strictly nihilistic religion. Buddha steps on stage, and the only thing that is important is nirvana. Everything else is done away with. So original Buddhism is entirely nihilistic. And at the same time that Buddha was propounding these ideas, there was a philosophical movement known as the Sankhya system. And the Sankhya system was one of the first Hindu systems that began to spin out theories about the origins of matter, the three gunas, the Purusha, which is the soul, and its involvement in Prakriti, matter, without any reference to deities whatsoever. So India indeed did begin to enter into a period of rationalism, and but Spengler's thesis almost doesn't work here because the Hindus sort of made a recovery, and the period he says they should be falling apart, they're really going through a restructuring, and they sort of get it back together again for a while. But so that's sort of Spengler's starting point, is that all civilizations go through a cycle of rise and fall. And then he says there are 9 civilizations that have done this. And he eschews any sort of model of the great chain of being. He doesn't want any kind of evolution of consciousness here, except within the particular culture in question, going through this life cycle of beginning with inspired religiosity, moving into a lyrical, poetic phase, then into a kind of prosaic philosophical phase, and then into a disintegration. That cultural life cycle is the only thing that has to do with the kind of evolution of consciousness that he will admit to in history. But what he does is he says, my thesis represents a Copernican vision of history, as opposed to a Ptolemaic one. Now, what's a Ptolemaic vision of history? Well, a Ptolemaic vision of history is what you always get when you sit down in a classroom and they say, open your textbooks to the Greeks, and we'll start there, with this ridiculous ancient medieval modern scheme where everything ends up with the moderns, and we as moderns are the center of the universe, and everything has led up to this point, and we're just the greatest thing on earth. Well, Spengler says, no, if each one of these civilizations has gone through the morphology of its life cycle, then what we're going through now is a life cycle embedded within Northern European civilization that is analogous to all of these others. Each one of these 9 cultures can be regarded as its own center, within which each one of these civilizations develops its own mathematics, its own arts, its own sciences. There is no history of art. There is no history of science. There is no history of truth. There are simply truths that make sense only when you look at them in the context of the civilization out of which it emerged. So looking at these 9 civilizations then, we sort of start with the Babylonian, although Spengler doesn't say much about them because the Sumerian information had not come in yet, and the Babylonians are to the Sumerians what the Romans are to the Greeks and what we are to the Europeans. So we have the Babylonian civilization, which dates from 3500 BC. And he says each one of these civilizations lasts for about 1,000 years. So it takes about 1,000 years for a civilization to go through this life cycle. And if you look at the cultures which are around today in terms of the high civilizations, if you look and you say the Muslim world is still around, it's much older than that, the Hindus are here, the Chinese are here, well, in a certain sense, they've passed their moment of creative lyricism. These are sort of gigantic petrified logs in a gigantic forest. What they're picking up from is the vitality of the West beginning to enter into its dying phase. And that's sort of revitalizing them momentarily. But otherwise, they're these sort of gigantic petrified logs within this forest. And so we have the Babylonian civilization going through, 3,500 to about 2,500 BC. And each one of these civilizations has its own informing idea. And this is the crucial thing about Spengler. This central Platonic idea that is the organizing archetype for every aspect of that civilization. It's trying to exteriorize that idea as though it were the soul of the culture. Spengler got this from Goethe's model of plant growth, because Goethe had said every aspect of any plant, if you look, whether you're looking at the roots, or whether you're looking at the corolla, whether you're looking at the sex organs of the plant, what you're looking at is a modified leaf. In every case, the leaf is the archetype out of which all plants are transformed in every single aspect of the plant. Open an orange and you'll see modified leaves in there that have been sectioned off. That was Goethe's idea. And so Spengler sort of picks up that idea. Instead of leaf as the central organizing idea, each culture has its own central organizing idea that is the metaphysical soul of that civilization. And once that civilization has exhausted everything that it wants to do in terms of getting it out, of articulating that idea, it exhausts itself and begins to die, sink into the earth, and return back to the mother, just like a plant. So these civilizations are analogous to these sort of gigantic plants that grow up out of the earth, flower, and then die again. So it's a very organic model. And the sort of primary idea for the Babylonian culture is line and angle in space. There's a kind of rectilinear emphasis in Babylonian art when you look at it. Everything is very angular. The Babylonians took over the ziggurat from the Sumerians, and the original Sumerian ziggurat was in the shape of a cow vagina, which is this gigantic round thing. And the Babylonians took over that idea from them, and they have this very sharp, right-angled, rectilinear civilization that they built out of that. Then we go from the Babylonian to the Egyptian. And the Egyptian culture, the dates are about 3000 BC for its creative period to about 2000 BC. Well, actually further down than that, but it begins to fall apart right about 2000 BC. And the central organizing idea of Egyptian civilization is this idea of what he calls the way. And by the way, what he means is when you look at every aspect of Egyptian culture, it's organized along a single narrow path leading toward the Day of Judgment. And every Egyptian had this in mind as a central anxiety of his existence. That Day of Judgment was coming. And if you're looking at the sort of avenue of the Sphinxes, in order to get into any of these temples, you have to walk down this long corridor. You can't go to the right, you can't go to the left. Destiny is pushing you, and you are gliding along its surface toward the throne of Osiris, the day where you will be judged. There was no apocalypse in Egyptian civilization, but they had this miniature apocalypse for each individual, had to face the scales within which the heart was weighed against a feather of the goddess Mot. And that feather represented truth, and the heart represented the soul. The heart was the only organ that the Egyptians left in the body, because you're going to need that to weigh it on the scale. And if the heart is heavier than the feather, you have not lived a life in accordance with truth. In other words, you have not lived a spiritual life. And there's a little monster, a crocodile monster over here waiting to gobble it up. Right. And you're out of luck. And if, however, the feather is heavier than the heart, then the initiate will be ushered over to the throne of Osiris, who sits as Lord of the Dead, and you'll be granted your immortality or reincarnation as Osiris sees fit.